The conference room was silent when the inquiry resumed. Elder Shketh sat in the center with Araveth beside them and Kethrava on the far side, with anger still burning in her amber eyes. Captain Yoon stood with the human delegation, and G1 sat in the center holding Bile in her arms. The cub was calm and alert, and her golden eyes moved from face to face, as if she understood that her future was being decided in this room. I wish to present new evidence, G1 said before anyone else could speak. Kethrava made a sound of disgust, but she hath raised a claw. You may proceed. G1 nodded to Dr. Beek Yoonji, who stepped forward with a data pad. This is a medical analysis of the subject. Bile, Yoonji said. I have been monitoring her health since the day she was rescued, and I have documented a clear pattern of bonding behavior. She projected the data onto the wall so everyone could see when Park Ji-won is present. Yoonji continued. Bile's stress hormones remain at healthy baseline levels. When Ji-won leaves the room, the hormones spike within minutes, indicating distress. When Ji-won returns, they immediately return to normal. This pattern does not occur with any other individual. Araveth leaned forward with interest. This is consistent with parent-child bonding across many species. The Syleth observed exactly, Yoonji said. From a medical perspective, Bile has bonded with Ji-won as a parental figure. This is not proximity or familiarity. This is genuine attachment. Kethrava stood up abruptly. This proves nothing, she said. The creature has simply imprinted on the first being that fed it. It would have bonded with anyone. Then why did you throw her away? Ji-won asked quietly. Kethrava turned to face her with fury in her eyes. What did you say? Ji-won stood up slowly. With Bile in her arms, you said she would bond with anyone. Ji-won said, you said she would attach to whoever fed her. But none of your people fed her. None of your people held her, or comforted her, or cared whether she lived or died. You threw her in the garbage and walked away. That is our custom. Your custom. Ji-won repeated. Your custom is to throw away babies who are not perfect enough for you. Your custom is to let children die alone in the darkness because their paws are the wrong shape. Do not talk to me about what is natural when your people do that. The room was very quiet. Shketh spoke in a measured tone. There is a clause in the consortium charter, the elder said, regarding protective guardianship of abandoned dependents. If a legitimate bond has been established, a species may claim guardianship over an abandoned individual of another species. Kethrava's face went pale. The clause was never meant for situations like this. The language is not specific. Arvith said, I have reviewed it myself, and it could apply here. Kethrava looked from Shketh to Arvith and back again. You cannot be serious. She said, you would allow these humans to take a Velati citizen based on an obscure legal technicality. Captain Yoon stepped forward with respect. He said, the technicality was created by your people when you threw a baby in the garbage. We simply found what you discarded. The evidence supports a genuine bond. Shketh said, the medical data is clear and multiple witnesses have testified to the relationship between Park Ji-won and the cub. Araveth nodded slowly. I moved to apply the guardianship clause. The Syleth said. Kethrava slammed her hand on the table. This is outrageous, she shouted. You cannot simply give away a Velati child to aliens, then take her back. Ji-won said. Everyone turned to look at her. Ji-won walked toward Kethrava until they were standing face to face. Take her back. Ji-won said again. If the Velati want Bile, then take her. Raise her as one of your own. Give her a home and a family and a future. Kethrava stared at her without speaking. I will not fight you if that is what you want. Ji-won continued. If you will love her and protect her and help her grow into everything she can be, then take her. She held out Bile toward Kethrava. The cub looked up at the Velati with her golden eyes and made a soft questioning sound. Kethrava did not move. She did not reach out. She did not take the cub. The silence stretched on and on. Do you want her? Arveth asked finally. Will the Velothi take responsibility for this child and raise her as their own? Kethrava's mouth opened, but no words came out. Elder Shketh spoke quietly. The question is simple, they said. Do you want her back or not? Kethrava looked at Bile with her twisted paw and her golden eyes and her silver blue fur. And Jawan saw the truth in her face. She did not want her. She had never wanted her. None of them did. The silence was all the answer anyone needed. I moved to grant guardianship. To Park Jawan, Shketh said, on behalf of the human community of Kepler Station, I second the motion. Orveth said, the motion passes. Shketh said, let the record show that the cub known as Bile is hereby placed under the protective guardianship of the humans. Kethrava stood frozen for one long moment. Then she turned and walked out of the room without another word. Jiwan held Bile close and felt tears streaming down her face. It is over, little star, she whispered. You are safe now. You are mine. Bile chirped and reached up with her small paw to touch Jiwan's cheek, the malformed paw, the one that had started everything. Captain Yoon put his hand on Jiwan's shoulder. You did it, he said. We did it, she said. All of us. In the weeks that followed, word of the ruling spread through consortium space. Many species did not understand why humans would fight so hard for one defective cub of an alien race. But others reached out quietly. They wanted to know more about these strange beings who valued life not for its usefulness, but simply because it existed. Small delegations came to Kepler Station. They watched the humans go about their daily lives. They saw how the community had embraced Bile as one of their own. They saw the cub running through the corridors, chasing the children of human workers and playing games and laughing in her own chirping way. And some of them began to wonder if perhaps they had been wrong about what strength really meant. Months passed and Bile grew. Her malformed paw never healed, but she learned to use it anyway. She climbed and ran and played just like any other child. She learned human words and Velothi words, and she mixed them together in ways that made everyone smile. She was happy. One evening, Jiwan sat in her quarters after a long shift. Bile climbed into her lap and curled up against her chest. Her tiny malformed paw rested against Jiwan's palm, just as it had on that first night. And the Farvan paw rested against Jiwan's palm, just as it had on that first night in the medical bay. Jiwan looked down at the small creature who had changed her life in ways she never could have imagined. She thought about how one tiny paw reaching out from a garbage container had set everything in motion, how that simple gesture of trust had challenged the beliefs of ancient species, how it had forced the mighty Velothi to confront the cruelty of their customs, how it had reminded the Mordath of their own painful history, how it had shown the galaxy that strength was not about perfection. Bile looked up at her with golden eyes full of love and contentment. She chirped softly and pressed closer. Jiwan smiled and held her tight. Sometimes the smallest hand holds the power to reshape worlds, she whispered. Bale chirped again as if she agreed outside the station. The stars continued their eternal dance through the darkness, and somewhere in that vast galaxy, a new story was being told. A story about a cub who was thrown away, and the human who refused to let her go. A story about one tiny paw that changed everything. The message came to Jiwan's personal terminal 30 minutes after the recess began. It was short and simple, and it made her heart race. Elder Shketh of the Mordath requests a private meeting with the human Park Jiwan. She left Bile in the care of Dr. Bikyunji and made her way to the small observation deck where Shketh was waiting. The Mordath stood alone by the viewing window, looking out at the stars in the darkness. Their exoskeleton gleamed like polished obsidian, and their compound eyes reflected the distant lights of passing ships. You came? Shketh said without turning around. You asked me to. Sheth made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else entirely. I did not expect You to come alone. G1 walked to stand beside the elder and looked out at the same stars. You wanted to tell me something, she said. Something you could not say in front of the others. Shketh was silent for a long moment. Do you know the history of the Mordith? The elder asked finally. Only what everyone knows, G1 said. You were one of the founding species of the consortium, along with the Velothi and the Silith. Shketh nodded slowly. What everyone knows. They repeated, but there is much that everyone does not know. Much that we have worked very hard to make sure everyone forgets. G1 waited. Shketh turned to face her, and those compound eyes held something that looked almost like pain. The Mordith were once like the Velothi. Shketh said, we called our young when they were born with defects. Irregular exoskeletons or missing limbs, or any difference that marked them as less than perfect. We called it mercy. We told ourselves we were protecting the species from weakness. G1 felt a cold weight settle in her chest. For centuries, we destroyed our own children. Shketh continued, we threw them away, just as the Velothi threw away that cub. And we convinced ourselves that it was right and natural and necessary. What changed? G1 asked. Shketh made that strange sound again. A child was born to the ruling house. They said, the most powerful family among the Mordith at that time. The child was perfect in every way except one. One of their wings was malformed and could not fold properly against their back. G1 thought of Bile and her twisted paw. The ruling family faced a choice. Shketh said they could destroy the child as tradition demanded, or they could hide the defect and pretend it did not exist. They chose to hide it, and the child lived, and the child grew up to be one of the greatest leaders the Mordith have ever known. Shketh said, they united the scattered Mordith colonies and led us into the consortium, and they changed the laws so that no Mordith child would ever be called again. Shketh turned back to the window. That leader was my ancestor. They said, the wing that could not fold is why I carry the name Shketh, which means broken flight in the old language. I carry it to remember what we almost lost. G1 stared at the elder with new understanding when that cub touched my claw. Shketh said quietly, I saw my ancestor. I saw every Mordith child who was thrown away before we learned better. I saw the shame of what we were. Why are you telling me this? G1 asked. Because I cannot officially take your side, Shketh said. The consortium requires neutrality from inquiry judges, and I will not violate that oath. But I can give you information. What information? There is a clause in the consortium charter. Shketh said, it is very old and very rarely used, but it has never been removed. Any species may claim protective guardianship over an abandoned dependent if they can prove that a legitimate bond has been formed. G1's heart began to beat faster. The clause was originally meant for situations where crew members were rescued from destroyed ships and taken in by other species. Shketh continued. But the language is not specific. It could apply to your situation. How do I prove a bond exists? Shketh considered this for a moment. You would need evidence. They said, medical evidence that the cub responds differently to you than to others. Testimony from witnesses who have seen the bond form. Anything that shows the connection is real, and not just proximity. G1 nodded slowly. There is something else you should know. Shketh said, what the Velothi representative, Kethrava, has been given authority to speak for the Velothi government in this matter. But authority can be revoked if she cannot justify her position. If you can make her admit that the Velothi do not actually want the cub back, then her claim becomes much weaker. Why would they not want her back? Because keeping her would require them to admit they made a mistake. Shketh said, and the Velothi do not like admitting mistakes. G1 thought about this for a long moment. Thank you, she said finally. Shketh shook their head. I have given you nothing but information that exists in public records. They said, I have not taken your side, and I have not violated my oath. Do you understand? I understand. Shketh turned back to the stars. That cub, they said quietly, the way she reached out with her damaged paw, the way she trusted without fear. That is not weakness. That is a kind of strength that I have not seen in a very long time. Ji-won felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them away. Go, Shketh said. The recess will end soon, and you have work to do. Ji-won left the observation deck and walked back to the medical bay as fast as she could. Yoonji looked up when she entered. Bile is fine, the doctor said. She missed you though. Ji-won picked up the cub and held her close. I need your help, she said to Yoonji. With what medical evidence? Ji-won said. I need proof that Bile and I have formed a real bond. Something that cannot be denied or explained away. Yoonji's eyes lit up with understanding. Stress hormone analysis, she said. If I can show that Bile's cortisol levels drop significantly when you are present, compared to when you are not, that would be strong evidence of bonding. Can you do it? I can do it right now, Yoonji said. I have been monitoring her levels since the beginning, because I was worried about her health. I already have the data. She turned to her terminal and began pulling up records. Look at this, she said after a moment. When you leave the room, her stress hormones spike within minutes. When you return, they drop back to baseline almost immediately. The same pattern does not occur with anyone else. Ji-won looked at the graphs and felt hope bloom in her chest. That is the proof we need. Yoonji nodded. I will prepare a formal report, she said, and I will testify to what I have observed if necessary. Captain Yoon arrived a few minutes later with several other members of the human community. We heard what you need, he said. We are ready to testify about what we have seen. The way Bile responds to you and the way she has bonded with the community. Thank you, sir. Yoon put a hand on her shoulder. We are a small group here on this station, he said, but we take care of our own. And that includes Bile now. Whether the consortium likes it or not, the recess was almost over. Ji-won gathered her evidence and her witnesses and prepared to return to the conference room. Bile seemed to sense that something important was happening. She pressed close to Ji-won and made soft, chirping sounds as if she was trying to offer comfort. It is going to be all right, little star, Ji-won whispered. I promise you it is going to be all right. She did not know if she could keep that promise, but she was going to try. She was going to fight with everything she had, and maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. The hour was up, the inquiry was about to resume, and Ji-won was ready. The Consortium Inquiry Board arrived at Kepler Station exactly 12 days after Kethrava filed her complaint. Their ship was sleek and silver, and it docked at the main port with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone on the station stop what they were doing and watch. 3 representatives had been sent to judge the matter. The first was Kethrava herself speaking for the Valathi. The second was Elder Shketh of the Mordith, a tall insectoid being with a dark exoskeleton and compound eyes that reflected the light in strange patterns. The third was Arveth of the Silith, a creature that looked almost like flowing water, given solid form with translucent skin that shimmered. When they moved, Captain Yoon met them at the docking bay and escorted them to the station's conference room, which had been cleared and cleaned for the occasion. The humans had done everything they could to make the space look professional, but it was still small and worn compared to the grand halls where the consortium usually conducted its business. Ji-won waited in the medical bay with Bile. The cub was several weeks old now, and she had grown strong and curious. Her silver-blue fur was thick and healthy, and her golden eyes were bright with intelligence. She could walk on her own now, though she still preferred to be carried. And she had learned to make a dozen different sounds that seemed to have specific meanings. Her malformed paw had not changed. It was still smaller and weaker than the others, but Bile used it anyway. She reached out with it and grabbed things and held onto Ji-won's fingers and refused to let the weakness define her. When the summons came for Ji-won to appear before the inquiry board, she picked up Bile and held her close. "You are coming with me, little star," she whispered. "They need to see you," Bile chirped and pressed her small body against Jiwan's chest. The conference room was silent when Jiwan entered. Kethrava sat on one side of the long table with a look of cold satisfaction on her beautiful face. Elder Shketh and Oravith sat in the center as neutral judges. Captain Yoon stood at the far end, ready to speak on behalf of the human delegation, and facing all of them was a single, empty chair meant for Jiwan. She walked to it and sat down. With Bile in her arms, the cub looked around at all the strange beings and made a soft questioning sound. Captain Yoon spoke first. He presented the human position in calm, measured terms. He explained that Bile had been abandoned and left to die in a waste container. Under consortium law, he argued abandoned property could be salvaged by whoever found it. The humans had simply salvaged what the Velati had thrown away. Kethrava interrupted him with a sharp laugh. "The creature is not property," she said. "It is a Velati citizen, and the humans had no right to interfere with Velati customs regarding defective offspring." "Then why was she in the garbage?" Captain Yoon asked. Kethrava's eyes flashed with anger, but she did not answer. The debate continued for nearly an hour. Legal terms were thrown back and forth, and old precedents were cited, and neither side seemed willing to give ground. Through it all, Bile sat quietly in Jiwan's arms and watched everything with her golden eyes. Finally, Elder Sheth raised one clawed appendage, and the room fell silent. "We have heard the legal arguments," Shketh said in a voice that sounded like dry leaves scraping together. "Now we wish to hear from the human who found the cub." Jiwan stood up and walked to the center of the room. Bile clung to her shirt and looked up at the inquiry board without fear. "Speak," Arveth said in a voice like flowing water. Jiwan took a deep breath and began. "I am not a diplomat or a lawyer," she said. "I am a maintenance technician, and my job is to collect garbage and fix broken things. 12 days ago, I was doing my job when I heard something crying in a waste container. I looked inside, and I found a baby that someone had thrown away." She paused and looked at Kethrava. The baby was dying. Jiwan continued. "She was cold and hungry and alone, and she had been left in the darkness to wait for death. I could not walk away from that. I did not know how anyone could walk away from that." Kethrava started to speak, but Shketh raised a claw, and she fell silent. "I know that different species have different customs," Jiwan said. "I know that the Velati consider imperfect offspring to be a burden. But I am human, and humans see things differently." She lifted Bile so that the inquiry board could see her clearly. "This is Bile," Jiwan said. "She is smart and curious and strong. She has a paw that does not work the way it should, but that has not stopped her from learning to walk and climb and explore. She is not a burden. She is not defective. She is alive, and she wants to stay alive, and I cannot understand why that is not enough." Arveth leaned forward and studied the cub with shimmering eyes. "Why do you fight so hard for this creature?" Arveth asked. "She is not of your species, and she will never be human." "What is she to you?" Jiwan looked down at Bile, who looked back up at her with complete trust. "She is someone who needed help," Jiwan said, "and I was there to give it. Is that not enough?" Before anyone could respond, Bile did something unexpected. She squirmed in Jiwan's arms and chirped loudly. Then she climbed down and dropped to the floor. Jiwan reached for her, but Bile was already moving. The cub walked across the conference room floor. On her small, unsteady legs, she walked past Kethrava, who watched her with disgust. She walked past Oraveth, who watched her with curiosity. And then she stopped in front of Elder Shketh. The Mortith was tall and dark, and covered in a hard exoskeleton that looked like armor. Compound eyes stared down at the tiny creature who had just walked up to one of the most powerful beings in the room. Bile sat down and looked up at Shketh. Then she reached up with her front paw, the malformed one. The one that someone had decided made her worthless. She pressed that tiny broken paw against Shketh's claw and held it there. The room went completely silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Elder Shketh stood frozen with a Velothi cub's paw touching one of their claws. Something changed in those compound eyes. Something shifted and softened and became something that might have been pain or memory or recognition. The moment stretched on and on. Finally, Shketh spoke in a voice that was quieter than before. This inquiry will recess. The elder said, "We will resume in 1 hour." Shketh stood and walked out of the room without another word. Arveth followed after a moment, leading only the humans, and Kethrova behind. Jiwan picked up Bile and held her close. The cub chirped softly and rested her head against Jiwan's shoulder. "What just happened?" Captain Yoon whispered. Jiwan shook her head. "I do not know, sir." Kethrova stared at them with confusion and anger on her face. "This changes nothing," she said. "The law is the law." But there was doubt in her voice now. Something had happened when Bile touched Elder Shketh's claw, something that none of them fully understood. Jiwan carried Bile back to the medical bay and sat down in the chair where she had spent so many hours watching over the small creature. "What did you do, little star?" she whispered. Bile chirped and reached up with her malformed paw to touch John's face. It was the same gesture she had made with Sheth, simple and trusting and completely without fear. Jiwan closed her eyes and held her close, whatever happened. Next, she would face it. But something told her that Bile had just changed the game in ways that none of them could have predicted. One tiny paw reaching out in trust. It was such a small thing, but sometimes small things were exactly what the universe needed to change. The first week was the hardest. Dr. Baek Yoonji slept in the medical bay on a cot she dragged in from storage, and Jiwan came every moment. She was not working to sit beside the small creature who was fighting so hard to live. They called her Bail. It meant star in the old Korean language, and Jiwan thought it was a good name for something small and bright that refused to stop shining even in the darkest places. Bile grew stronger each day. Her silver blue fur became soft and clean after. Jiwan spent hours gently washing away the filth from the garbage container. Her sealed eyes opened on the 4th day, and they were the color of pale gold like sunlight coming through. "Honey." She looked at Jiwan first and made a small chirping sound. That seemed to say hello. The human quarter of Kepler station was not large, and word spread quickly about the abandoned Velothi cub that the maintenance technician had rescued. People began to stop by the medical bay to see her. They brought small gifts like soft blankets and toys made from spare parts and food that they hoped might be good for a growing cub. Off-duty workers volunteered to take shifts bottle-feeding Bile when Jiwan had to work, and Yoonji needed to sleep. The station cook, named Grandmother Han by everyone who knew her, made special formula based on Yoonji's instructions, and she always added a little extra because she said the baby was too thin. Bile seemed to understand that she was surrounded by creatures who wanted her to live. She relaxed into their care, and she grew, and she began to make more sounds, but she always watched the door, and whenever Jiwan walked in, Bile would make a specific chirp that she made for no one else. It was clear to everyone that the cub had chosen her person. Captain Yoon came to visit on the 8th day. He stood in the doorway of the medical bay and watched as Jiwan fed Bile from a small bottle. The cub's malformed paw rested against the bottle as she drank, and her golden eyes were half closed with contentment. "She looks better," Yoon said. "She is a fighter, sir." Yoon nodded slowly, and then his expression became serious. "A Velothi trade delegation is scheduled to arrive tomorrow," he said. "There is no way to hide her from them." Jiwan, "I was not planning to hide her." Yoon studied her face for a long moment. "They will not be happy about this. I imagine they will not be. What will you do if they demand her back?" Jiwan looked down at Bile, who had finished her bottle and was now trying to climb up Jiwan's arm with her small paws. "I will tell them no," Jiwan said simply. Yoon was quiet, and then he let out a long breath. "I have been reading the consortium charter," he said. "There may be legal options we can use if things become difficult." "Thank you, sir." "Do not thank me yet," he said as he turned to leave. We are a small human outpost with almost no political power, and the Velothi have been members of the consortium for 1,000 years. G1 held Bile close and said nothing. The Velothi delegation arrived the next afternoon. There were 5 of them, and they moved through the station with the easy confidence of beings who knew they were beautiful and important and far above everyone around them. Their leader was called Senior Merchant Kethrava, and she was tall and elegant with fur, the color of pure silver and eyes like polished amber. She came to the human quarter to discuss trade agreements, but she stopped in her tracks. When she passed the medical bay and saw what was inside, G1 was sitting with Bile on her lap, and she looked up to find Kethrava staring at her through the window. The Velothi's beautiful face twisted with something that looked like disgust. She walked into the medical bay without asking permission. "What is this?" Kethrava demanded. "This is Bile." G1 said calmly. Kethrava's eyes moved over the cub and stopped on the malformed paw. "That is a Velothi infant," she said, and her voice was cold and sharp. "Why do you have it? I found her in a garbage container." G1 said, "She was dying, so I saved her." "You should not have interfered." G1 felt her hands tighten around Bile, and she forced herself to stay calm. She was thrown away like trash. G1 said, "I do not call saving a dying baby interference." Kethrava's lip curled with contempt. "You do not understand our ways, human," she said. "The creature is defective, and defective offspring are a drain on resources and an insult to the family line. We remove them quickly and quietly, and we do not speak of them again. It is the natural order." G1 stood up slowly, and Bile clung to her shirt with her small paws. "The natural order," G1 repeated. Yes, G1 took a step toward Kethrava, and she did not blink. "Tell me something," G1 said. Has Bile hurt anyone? Kethrava's eyes narrowed, but she did not answer. Has she stolen anything or lied or cheated or caused any harm to any living being anywhere in this galaxy? That is not the point. Then what is the point? G1 asked. What exactly has this baby done to deserve death? She is imperfect. G1 felt something inside her grow very cold and very still. Among my people, she said, a life is not measured by its usefulness. A life has value simply because it exists. Kethrava stared at her as if she was speaking a language that made no sense. This is not your concern, human, she said finally. This matter will be escalated, and the consortium will decide what happens to the creature. Her name is Bile. Kethrava turned and walked out of the medical bay without another word. Captain Yoon appeared in the doorway a moment later, and his face was grim. You heard? G1 said, I heard, and I think we are about to have a much bigger problem than trade agreements. G1 looked down at Bile, who was looking up at her with those golden eyes. The cub made a soft chirping sound, and it was different from any sound she had made before. It was almost like she was trying to say something to communicate. G1 felt her heart crack open a little more. This small creature had been thrown away by her own people because her paw was not perfect. She had been left in the darkness to die alone and cold and forgotten, but she had refused to give up. She had cried out, and G1 had heard her, and now they were bound together by something that no trade delegation or legal ruling could ever break. I do not care what the consortium decides, G1 whispered to Bile. I do not care what the Velothi want. You are mine now, and I will never let anyone throw you away again. Bile chirped again and reached up with her tiny paw, the malformed one. She pressed it against G1's cheek and held it there. In that moment, G1 understood that Bile was not just surviving anymore. She was bonding, she was choosing, and she had chosen. G1. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The consortium could send their lawyers and their diplomats and their judges. The Velothi could make their demands and their threats and their speeches. About natural order, none of it would matter, because G1 had made a promise to a tiny creature with a broken paw, and she was not the kind of person who broke her promises outside the medical bay, the station continued its slow rotation through the cold darkness of space, somewhere in the consortium. Headquarters officials were probably already receiving reports about the human who had interfered. With Velothi customs, somewhere the wheels of interstellar bureaucracy were beginning to turn. But inside the medical bay, there was only warmth and light, and the soft sound of a cub chirping to the person who had saved her life. For now, that was enough. Tomorrow would bring its own babbles. But tonight, Bile was safe and loved, and that was a victory worth celebrating. Jiwan held her close and watched her fall asleep, and she made herself a silent promise, whatever it took, whatever it cost. She would give this small creature the life she deserved, the life that her own people had decided she was not worthy of. Bile deserved to grow up knowing that she mattered, and Jiwan was going to make sure she did. Par Ji-1 hated the lower levels of Kepler Station more than anything else about her job as a maintenance technician. But someone had to collect the garbage, and today that someone was her. The corridors down here were dark and cold, and they smelled like rust and old food and chemicals that nobody could identify anymore. She pushed her hovercart through the narrow passages and tried not to think about how far she was from the warm lights and clean air of the human quarter Kepler Station sat. On the edge of consortium space, it was the kind of place where broken things came to be forgotten. The station had been built by the Velothi centuries ago, and then abandoned when they found better trade routes. Now it served as a hub for small traders and refugees and species that did not fit anywhere else. Humans had arrived only 3 years ago, and they kept mostly to themselves in a small section of the middle decks. Ji-1 stopped her cart beside a large waste container and prepared to empty it into the compactor. She reached for the release lever, but then she heard something that made her freeze. It was a sound so small and weak that she almost missed it beneath the hum of the station systems. A whimper. She stood very still and listened. The sound came again, and this time she was certain it came from inside the container. Ji-1 pulled herself up onto the edge and looked down into the mess of discarded cargo netting and food waste and broken machine parts. At first, she saw nothing but garbage. Then something moved. A tiny shape struggled beneath a torn piece of netting, and Ji-1 felt her heart stop when she realized what she was looking at. It was a cub. The creature was no bigger than her 2 hands placed together, and it was covered in silver blue fur that was matted with filth. 4 small paws pushed weakly against the netting that trapped it, and its eyes were still sealed shut the way newborn creatures often were. Ji-1 recognized the species immediately. This was a Velothi cub. The Velothi were one of the founding races of the consortium, and they were known throughout the galaxy for their beauty and their wealth and their absolute devotion to perfection. Ji-1 climbed into the container without thinking, and she pushed aside the garbage until she could reach the tiny creature. The cub was barely breathing. Its fur was cold, and its body trembled with each weak heartbeat. She lifted it carefully, and that was when she noticed why someone had thrown this baby away like garbage. The cub's front left paw was wrong. It was smaller than the others and twisted at an odd angle, and it would never work the way it was supposed to work. Among the Velothi and many other consortium species, a defect like this was unacceptable. Imperfect offspring were considered a burden on resources and a stain on family honor. They were disposed of quietly, and no one spoke of them again. Ji-1 had heard about this practice, but she had never seen the evidence of it with her own eyes until now. She stood in that garbage container, holding a dying baby that someone had thrown away, because its paw was not perfect, and she felt something inside her chest turn to iron. She climbed out of the container and wrapped the cub in her maintenance jacket. The creature was so weak that it barely reacted, but she could feel its tiny heart still beating against her palm. She abandoned her cart and walked as fast as she could toward the human quarter captain. Yoon Se-jun was in his office when she burst through the door without knocking. He looked up from his terminal with surprise, and then his eyes moved to the bundle in her arms. Ji-1, he said slowly and carefully. What have you done? She placed the wrapped cub on his desk and pulled back the jacket to reveal the shivering creature inside. "Someone threw her in the garbage, sir." Yoon stood up and looked at the cub for a long moment before he spoke again. "That is a Velothi infant," he said, and his voice was heavy with the weight of everything those words meant. "I know what she is. Do you know what will happen if the Velothi find out we have her?" "I know, sir, and you brought her here anyway." Ji-won met his eyes without flinching. "I was not going to leave her there to die." Yoon ran his hand over his face and let out a long breath. "This could create a diplomatic incident, Park," he said. "The Velothi do not like outsiders interfering with their customs, and the consortium will support them over us every time. Then let them come," Ji-won said, and her voice did not waver. "Let them explain to me why a baby deserves to die, because her paw is not shaped correctly." The cub made a small sound then, and both of them looked down at her. She was trying to move, and her tiny legs pushed against the jacket as if she was searching for warmth. Her malformed paw moved just like the others. Even though it was smaller and weaker, Jae-won picked her up again and held her against her chest. "I need to get her to medical," she said. Yoon was silent for a moment, and then he nodded. "Go," he said. "But Ji-won, you need to understand that I may not be able to protect you from what comes next." "I understand, sir." She turned and walked out of his office, and she did not look back. The human medical bay was small and crowded with equipment that was never quite new enough or quite right for alien patients. Dr. Beek. Yoonji was there when Ji-won arrived, and her eyes went wide when she saw what Ji-won was carrying. "Please," Ji-won said, and her voice finally cracked. "Please help her." Yoonji took the cub from her arms and placed her on an examination table. She ran her scanner over the tiny body, and her face grew more serious with each passing second. "She is severely dehydrated, and her temperature is dangerously low," Yoonji said. "I have no experience with Velothi physiology, but I will do everything I can." Ji-won stood beside the table and watched as Yoonji worked. The doctor pulled up everything the station database had on Velothi biology, and she mixed together a nutrient formula based on the limited information available. She warmed the formula and placed tiny drops of it on the cub's lips. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then the cub's mouth moved, and she began to swallow. Ji-won felt tears running down her face, but she did not wipe them away. Hours passed, and Yoonji did not leave the cub's side. She adjusted the formula and monitored the tiny heartbeat and made small sounds of encouragement. Each time, the creature showed signs of improvement. Ji-won stayed too. She could not make herself leave. Near midnight, the cub opened her mouth and made a sound that was stronger than any sound she had made before. It was not quite a cry and not quite a call, but it was alive, and it was demanding, and it meant that she wanted to survive. Ji-won reached out and touched the cub's side gently. The tiny creature turned toward her touch, and then something happened that Ji-won would remember for the rest of her life. The cub reached out with her front paw, not the strong paw, the small one, the broken one that someone had decided made her worthless. That tiny malformed paw wrapped around Ji-won's finger and held on with surprising strength. Ji-won looked down at the small creature who was holding onto her like she was the only solid thing in a universe that had tried to throw her away. "I have you now," Ji-won whispered, "and I am not letting go." The cub made another small sound, and her grip on Ji-won's finger tightened. In that moment, something changed between them. It was not something that could be measured or explained or written down in any report. It was simply a promise made in silence between two living beings who had found each other against all odds. Ji-won did not know what would come next. She did not know if the Velothi would demand the cub back or if the consortium would punish the humans for interfering. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would fight for this tiny life. She would fight anyone and anything that tried to take her away, because this small creature with her broken paw had reached out and chosen to hold on, and Ji-won was going to make sure that choice meant something.